This is a collaborative event with the Future of City Centre Network, and it's also a celebration because Bob Giddings and Robert Rogerson, who are discussing today, they're edited volume called Future of the City Centre Global Perspectives. And we're very lucky that 4 of the book chapter authors are here today to present as our speakers this afternoon. So we're very happy about that. I did circulate in the pre-material for the meeting a flyer for the book. And you can also, I'm sure, speak to Bob and Robert about the works contained within it. And can contact them via their website, which is futurecitycentre.com. So the format of today is I'm going to hand over in a second to Bob for some introductory remarks. We'll then have our 4 opening statements from our presenters, which we're very excited for. We're going to take them back to back. And then after that, there'll be an opportunity for a panel discussion and also for you to participate in the discussion. So I would encourage everyone during the session to use the chat functionality. So post in there your comments, your questions to the panelists, links to relevant material and so on. And we'll try and pick up as much of that as we can in the plenary Q&A. Also, when we get to the Q&A part, if you'd like to appear on camera to ask a question to one or all of our panel, please use the hand raise functionality during that part of the session. So if you'd like to tweet about the session as well, you can get with us on Twitter at COVID in Society. So please at COVID in Society in the tweet. I know our IPPO's editor will be excerpting proceedings on Twitter as we go forward. I'll also say as well that Bob and Robert wrote a great article for us on the IPPO's website, kind of framing the discussion, which I also sent around. I'll put a link to this in the chat in a second. So you can also see some of the issues introduced by our 2 discussants there. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Bob Giddings, who will discuss and introduce himself and Robert and the rest of our panel. So Bob, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Hello, and welcome to this session on the future of the city centre. As Jeremy said, my name is Bob Giddings, and I'm Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at Northumbria University. And I'm joined by my fellow coordinator, Dr. Robert Rogerson, who is Academic Director of the Institute for Future Cities at the University of Strathclyde. The future of the city centre was originally an Arts and Humanities Research Council project, but is now an international network. The original project was based on 4 symposia in city centres in 4 different continents. The cities were Newcastle upon Tyne in UK, Newcastle, New South Wales in Australia, Pretoria, South Africa, and João Pessoa in Brazil. The profiles of these 4 cities and the 8 themes derived from the symposia form the structure of our recent book. The plan today is that the authors of 4 of those themed chapters will each make an opening statement for 10 minutes, followed by what we hope will be a lively discussion with questions. So as Jerry mentioned, please put up your hand or use the electronic hand when you wish to speak. And you can also add comments and questions on the chat button. Robert will summarize the session, and either he or I can answer any questions about the project and the network. So today we are joined by Jonathan Wallace, Board Director at the Planning and Development Consultancy Lichfields, who will speak on image, visions, and the public realm. Yingyin, Policy and Analyst in the Regional and Multi-Governance Division of the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, and she will address the topic from government to governance at the local level. Ton van Vuren is Regional Director for UK and Europe at Veitch Lister Consultancy, a multidisciplinary company specialising in transport, planning, analytics and modeling, policy and economics. And he will discuss mobility, movement and access. Sandra Guinon is Associate Professor at the École Supérieure Bordeaux and Associate Researcher at the Panthéon-Sorbonne University in Paris. And she'll talk about culture and heritage. So, Jonathan, would you like to start, please?
Excellent, I'll start. So good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I wanted to make a fairly simple but important point, which is really to recognise the importance of city centres. It's currently estimated that 56% of the world's 8 billion population live in cities. And by 2050, it's estimated this will have grown to 70%. And with city centres generally at the core of the city economy, city centres clearly have a huge role to play in the world's development. However, at present, many of our city centres reflect the fact that they were shaped by the needs of the 20th century. And as a result, many are still very dominated by commerce. This is a particular issue in the UK as a result of the many shopping-focused city centre redevelopments which took place between the 1960s and 1990s. And this resulted in often smaller scale but well-established businesses and other uses being pushed out of central locations. And in turn, that had a knock-on effect on diversity of use within those city centres. However, the need for so much retail floor space has fallen away over the last 2 decades, firstly through retail decentralisation, and more recently through the growth of e-commerce, which has grown very significantly over the last 10 years, particularly on the back of the emergence of smartphones and tablets. Also, the ability to work online or from home has reduced demand for office space too, and changing patterns of work as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic have accelerated this trend. So in many respects, city centres are currently at a crossroads. They've largely been shaped by the needs of the past, but we now need to move them forward to meet current and future challenges. So we've seen reduced demand for retail floor space, and here in the UK, this has resulted in some quite dramatic changes in city centres, as large retail properties have fallen vacant and footfall has fallen. However, while this has had a significant short-term impact, it's also opening up opportunities for other uses to establish or re-establish themselves. Residential uses are now becoming well established increasingly, both here in the UK and around the world. In North America, the flight of young people into city centres has been transformational. And this younger generation is less interested in home or car ownership, content to rent an apartment and use public transport rather than buy their own home or a car. And typically they spend a significant proportion of time in cafes, bars and restaurants, visiting the cinema, going to a concert, driving up footfall, particularly in the evenings. Health and education uses are also starting to come back into city centres. In the case of health, this is no doubt partly because of the growth in residential population and the obvious opportunity to provide health centres in highly accessible central locations. However, it also reflects the continuing growth in the number of students progressing into higher education and, of course, falls in city centre land values. The other key point I'd highlight is the increased emphasis on outdoor and public space. If we wind back to the 1970s and 1980s, we saw the development of many covered shopping malls in the heart of our cities. Many still exist, of course, but in recent years, this trend has been reversed, with the focus being on working within the existing street pattern and upon high quality outdoor spaces. I'm working on several projects in the UK at the moment where we are seeking to demolish former shopping centres and replace them with outdoor event spaces and public parks. And this trend has only increased following the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think made us all better understand the value of public spaces and the importance of city centres as places to gather and enjoy shared experiences. So city centres are changing, and in most countries around the world, there's a recognised need to plan for change, with various models for change being considered. I've highlighted 4 on my slide today, but there are others too. The eco-city model has been around for some time and is really quite an interesting concept. It's based upon the idea of developing an ecologically healthy city which operates on the basis of a self-contained economy that obtains resources locally, is carbon neutral, promotes walking, cycling, and the use of public transport systems, actively promotes and supports water and drainage efficiency, and promotes recycling and reuse to create a zero wastewater system. Green cities and sustainable cities are similar in many respects, both with a strong environmental focus. Sustainable cities are cities designed with consideration for their environmental, social and economic impact to provide a resilient habitat for existing populations without compromising future generations to experience the same. Green cities are similarly based around the idea of reducing environmental impact through a range of public policies, from reducing waste and expanding recycling through to increasing housing density and expanding open space. The fourth model I've identified, smart cities, are a little different. They look to the use of information and communication technologies and data as the means to solve city centre economic, environmental and social challenges. And they're basically built around intelligent and interconnected networks that share data using wireless technology, typically personal smartphones, which allow citizens, businesses and local authorities to receive, analyse and manage data in real time. Of course, to some extent, smart cities are already with us, and we can see developments in each city around us, from things like sensors on street lamps, which measure air quality, to the installation of photovoltaic panels on traffic lights and signs, and digital monitoring of waste collection. So smart cities are actually becoming part of our everyday lives, even as we speak. But of course, while all these models are interesting at a conceptual level, in developing ideas on how we can re-engineer our centres to better meet modern day needs, no one really wants city centres which all appear the same. City centres need their own identity and image, and where change is planned, the best approach is often to develop a master plan to guide that change. Historically, top-down approaches were used to develop master plans with fairly limited input from local communities or the private sector, but these approaches were often pretty ineffective. It's now generally accepted that master plan strategies need to be developed in a different way, based around a shared vision of city centres in the future, developed through consensus with all key stakeholders participating. The other key point I would highlight in relation to city centre visioning is the need for an authentic approach. While visions can and should be aspirational, they need to be really rooted in the place itself. A one-size-fits-all approach won't work, and visions and the strategies developed around them need to be based upon a clear understanding of the historical significance of the place, rather than a sort of manufactured marketing strategy. I hope I've got a couple of minutes left in my time to speak to a case study. I thought I would highlight the German city of Essen. It's not a city I've ever worked in, but it's a city that's fascinated me over the years. Those of you who don't know it, it's a city of 600,000 people. It's a city that's been shaped and scarred in many ways by heavy industry, particularly coal mining and steel production, with a functional but fairly nondescript city centre which was rebuilt in the aftermath of the Second World War. By the 1990s, the traditional industries were in decline and the city needed to reinvent itself to meet the needs of the future. And it began to transition at that time to more of a high-tech commercial centre, which was supported by the expansion of the 2 universities in the city. As part of its transition, there became a recognition of the need to expand the city's cultural offer, and this led to a successful bid to be the European Capital of Culture in 2010, which in turn resulted in significant growth in the number of theatres, museums and music venues in the city centre. Since 2010, the focus has shifted to the environment, and the city's developed further strategies based upon, in particular, blue-green solutions, which involve the creation of new water management systems, utilising smart technology to clean up the once polluted local rivers. The strategy's got a number of other strands too. Firstly, I'd highlight the social urban emission trading system that's being developed at the moment, which seeks to calculate each neighbourhood's ecological footprint, which can be compared against climate protection targets set by the city authorities, with areas that fail to meet those targets paying a fee into the city's budget. There are secondary proposals as well emerging now for urban farming in and around the city centre to make Essen more self-sufficient in terms of food production. And finally, while I don't want to stray too far into transport issues, as I know Tom's going to cover that, the city is highly focused on reducing vehicular journeys to and from the city centre, with their target being, which is quite astonishing from a UK perspective, but the aim is to reduce vehicular journeys to just 25% of all journeys across the city by promoting public transport and cycling in particular, taking advantage of the high levels of e-bike ownership locally in the area.
Great, thanks very much, Jonathan. I think move straight on to Wing. Thank you, Wing.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Okay, thank you very much, Bob. And so my presentation today, as you can see, looks at the future of city center through the governance perspective. And the main arguments that I want to make here is that the role of local governments needs to be shifted from the focus on policy implementation and service delivery to a more strategic role. It sounds a bit vague, so what does it mean? To put it a bit in the context, a main trend that we see is that the autonomy and responsibilities of local governments have been rising. As you can see here is the local autonomy index, and we can see a clear rising trend since 2015. What it suggests is that local governments have more responsibilities and more resources to mobilize and more decisions to make. At the same time, we hear more and more about this place-based solution, and also as highlighted by Jonathan in his presentation, one size fits all doesn't work. What does that mean? For example, we all talk about address climate change. One city may need to upgrade the energy efficiency of buildings, but the others need to focus on upgrading the transport network. What that entails is that local governments today, they may not have the guidance from the upper levels anymore, nor can they easily find the solutions from their peers. And they need to be more strategic in thinking of ways how to deliver their mandates and secure the well-being of the citizens. So when it comes to city-centered governance specifically, what are the particular challenges that require local governments to be strategic? First, there are just many actors involved in the development process. And more importantly, these actors are changing. They are not that easy to identify, and it's not straightforward how to structure the relationships and interactions among them. We all know there's going to be public sector, private sector, universities, and citizens involved. But let's take a local government example. We always see it as one entity, but there are urban planners, there's transport experts, there are housing departments, environment units. It may sound surprising, but what we see is that it's common in many cities, they don't work together or they don't work together that well. Another feature to highlight is the multiple scales or levels of governance. So here I will illustrate these points through the example of Prague. The city of Prague itself is a city and a region from a governance administrative perspective. And as a region, Prague also situates within the Central Bohemian region. So there's another level of governance. And within Prague, there were 57 districts. Also, what we can see is increasingly we emphasize these functional urban areas. So in Prague, there's also a metropolitan governance body, which mainly look at transport issues, for example, to coordinate with other municipalities. So you get the sense of the complexity of the scale of governance. And it's exactly in this background, local governments, what does it mean to be strategic? They need to be smart in engaging the right stakeholders, using the right structure and instruments and decision-making. So what exactly can be done and what needs to be done? First, setting a vision and objectives for city-centered development. We need to understand that local government officials, they have limited bandwidth, like they cannot support every project. Focusing on the projects that initiated by the large developers or secured by higher level funding, it makes sense because they're most likely to be successful. So having a strategy, a robust decision-making framework is to ingest this strategic view into their day-to-day operation. We have the OECD has been increasingly working on regional and local strategic planning because we exactly see that a lot of local governments still lack the knowledge or tools to do an actual long-term goal-based strategy. And the second thing I want to point out is to explore the appropriate instrument and mechanisms to structure the relations amongst different stakeholders. And I refer to two types of mechanism. The first is more contractual arrangements among the parties to specify their obligations in the development process. So this includes, for example, community benefits agreements, setting up business improvement district, youth developer obligations, etc. And the second type of mechanism, it's about engagement procedures. At which stage should we bring people together? What should we discuss and how? What we see increasingly is that those traditional way, let's say, commenting procedures, town hall meetings, public hearings, they just simply not that fit for purpose or efficient to address complex local governance issues we face today. For example, we heard a lot of local governments, they just have difficult time to engage young people in those hearings. And the last point is to what we call from participatory to anticipatory governance, that is to adopt a forward-looking, flexible way to city-centered development. I mean, this is gaining importance because we see all these mega trends such as demographic change or unexpected shocks such as COVID, we are all familiar with now. And there are many tools such as strategic foresight, scenario making, or changing the way how local government manage their knowledge. Instead of relying on experts for specific issue, more and more they try to rely on collective intelligence from stakeholders to anticipate the scenarios. But fundamentally, what it does is to challenge the traditional risk aversion culture, because anticipatory requires learning by doing and trial and error. And it also changes how local policymakers communicate with citizens, because they just simply cannot say, oh, we guarantee we will deliver this or that. The point of communication shifts to explaining why we make these decisions and based on what kind of trade-offs and scenarios. So I would like to just give you a very concrete examples that I like. In 2016, the city of Wuppertal, again in Germany, they planned to build a cable car. And the city decided to experiment a deliberative process called the planning cell, which is actually a theory developed by the scholars in Germany back in the 70s. And basically it runs several planning cells in parallel and address different elements of the same problem. So the city randomly selected 48 citizens to participate, to debate. What is interesting is that the experts and scholars from universities, engineers, and the company that hired to do the feasibility study of the cable car were asked to give presentation to the citizens and answer all their questions before the citizens actually go into debate. And the result is a citizens' report for the city council. It was interesting because it's not really about whether to build the cable car or not, it's about how. So they gave opinion, for example, you can build a cable car, but you cannot cut the expense of other public transport service. And I like this example because on the one hand, it's a very small project, and it demonstrates you can start with small practice. And it demonstrates you can be innovative to reconfigure the role and relationship between experts, companies, and citizens. And one message is that, of course, you cannot change the whole local government system to be more participatory overnight, but there are things you can start. I hope I have the last few minutes because I would like to zoom out a little bit and turn to the multi-level governance perspective, because we talked about a lot of things that local governments can do to be more strategic, but there are things that they cannot do. They live in a system, they operate in some sort of framework. It doesn't mean that they cannot be strategic in this perspective, but they need to be more proactive and innovative and influence higher level framework, use their means. So I want to highlight 3 points. The first one is to pursue the clarification of responsibilities and functions. This is really particularly important for city center because, as I mentioned, there are multiple governance layers. Sometimes what we see the risk is that higher level government may, what we call, pass the buck. We think city center development is just the responsibility of the city, but it can be of there are super local importance projects or issues that need to be addressed at a higher level. So the clarification is the key. And moving forward, building on that, it actively coordinates and collaborates with higher level government. We did a survey among almost 300 subnational governments in the EU, and we find that coordination from a local government perspective is extremely challenging. Also, we have been working on this topic for years. We provide recommendations to the national level in terms of what instruments and incentives they can put in place, and dialogue bodies they can ensure that local governments are involved. So this including working groups, but also territorial contracts, co-financing agreements, and city deals, for example, which I think most of the audience are familiar with. And then last but not least, capacity, capacity, and capacity. I think sometimes we just forget we cannot assume that local government have the know-how and tools to revive city center just because that's their responsibilities. From activities like organizing the planning cell or urban planning or elaborating a city center development strategy, creating a business improvement district, these are all capacity demanding. So continuous capacity building is a must. And so many of these topics that I mentioned and the OECD and our team has been working, I'm just sharing with you some examples here, and I will put the link on the chat. And I just want to highlight that increasingly we have this shift in our work. Instead of producing lengthy analytical reports, which the OECD may be famous for, we try to develop some practical manual and toolkits for governments to actually use in their day-to-day lives. And so actually here today, I'm also joined by my colleague, Andrew Lombardi, who co-authored the chapter with me, and he's the expert in city development. So we are looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Wing. So can we move on now to consider mobility, movement and access with Tom?
Thank you for inviting me to talk about my chapter in the book, Mobility, Movement and Access. And you'll be pleased to know there will not be a German example in my presentation. I'm talking about mobility, movement and access, as I say. And to be fair, as a transport planner, I thought that any discussion about city centers should focus on mobility and movement, but I'm probably a little bit biased. As Bob said, I'm Tom van Vuren, the regional director for the UK and Europe for Beach Lister Consulting, but I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Leeds and the policy director at the Transport Planning Society. I thought I'd start my presentation with the findings, the key messages, if you like, and these are that it's my expectation from a transport perspective that city centers of the future will be operating very much as they did hundreds of years successfully through a combination of fast access to and slow mobility within. And as we all know at the moment, too many city centers are easy to get to, but very unpleasant to move around in. Before diving into examples and solutions, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the problems, and some of which I think are due mainly to poor or outdated terminology. I actually trained as a traffic engineer, but I identify as a transport planner. Many people still use the word traffic to refer to flow by all modes, not just vehicles using the street network, and sometimes even to refer to the congestion that traffic can cause. And by continuing to use the word traffic, we subconsciously or even consciously focus on cars and car drivers, both as the problem and as a solution. The term mobility reflects that traveling to and within cities is done by a much wider range of modes, public transport, but also active modes such as walking and cycling. So the term mobility is much more inclusive, reflecting, for example, the needs of those without a car. Having said that, mobility is still something that is consumed. It represents the assumption that people need to move and that the best solution move as many people as fast as possible between 2 points A and B. Now, once we start talking about access, we change the way of thinking, including the needs of those that don't currently travel, understanding that city centers are not just places to get to, but mainly places to be in. The role of streets for both movement and for place, as promoted in, for example, many places in Australia now. And if you're interested in sort of the concept of access, I certainly can recommend the work by David Levinson from the University of Sydney, who's written a number of books on it. The world has changed. In the past 20 years, the number of trips made by the average person has dropped substantially, and that happened actually already well before COVID. So by 2019, the number of commute and shopping trips compared to 20 years earlier had already declined by 1/5. The number of business trips by even more. If you combine this with the impacts of COVID itself, and particularly the COVID impacts on individual modes, you can see that the reduction in the use of modes that are important to the city centre have been the greatest. In the example of London, the Underground is still furthest from its pre-pandemic levels, whereas buses outside of London and cars are back close to their 2019 demand levels. What does it mean for me? Future city centres must be much more than central business districts, and our transport thinking needs to reflect that. It is technology that is driving this change, and also a technology that is enabling alternatives to the car. So if we look at the 6 typical travel choice mechanisms that we consider in people's need for access and how people consume mobility. Technology has enabled people to make many fewer trips for work, leisure, eating out, visiting friends, doing business. Now, why is that? Zoom and Teams meetings as these, food deliveries via Uber Eats and the like, streaming services such as Netflix, so that you don't have to visit the cinema to go and see the latest release, the rise of social media, FaceTime, WhatsApp, to stay in touch with family and friends. Why go to the city center if you can what you want have delivered to your jacuzzi via the internet? Destination choice, mode choice are also affected. Deliveries don't tend to originate in city centers, but out of town, in the city's periphery. Emerging modes, particularly shared modes, can't exist without apps and reliable and fast internet connectivity. A business trip replaced by a Zoom call is an actual change of mode from a real travel to virtual travel. Real-time information provided by digital mapping apps are changing departure times and routes. And then there are finally expectations that this technological change will affect where people will choose to live, and generally less determined in future by easy access to the city center and its attractions. So technology from a transport perspective is delivering a double, quadruple, or even sextuple whammy to the importance of the city center, which leads me to pose that it's polycentricity rather than single city centers, which will be the future to plan for. An example of how this is already happening and shaping urban planning is in Sydney, where the Metropolis of 3 Cities concept underpins their strategic plan for 2050. Rather than all transport infrastructure being focused on accessing the current city center near the harbour, by car and by train, and in the morning peak hour, infrastructure will be used throughout the days. Roads and trains will be used in both directions. Alternatives to the car come into play because the much shortened distances compared to the current situation. How can this fast access and slow mobility be delivered? Let's first look at the car. Should the car be allowed to dominate and continue to dominate the city centre? In London, driver's license holding is actually quite a bit lower than in the rest of the country and has stabilized, whereas in the rest of the country it's still growing, and particularly among women. And let's not forget that many people don't own a car. they particularly in lower income groups. Electric or autonomous vehicles won't change that. And car-based access planning is, of course, highly inequitable. One of the easiest ways in which to reduce the role of cars in city center will be by managing parking. According to one source, there are 8 parking spaces per car in the US, and they cover more than 5% of urban land space. Surely you can do much better, and you can do a lot more with that space. And in Melbourne, it was calculated that indeed converting a commercial parking space to bicycle parking or a parklet would enable you to increase revenue by quite a bit. And think of what that number would look like if that parking space initially had been free. Is public transport the answer? It certainly has a role to play in providing fast access. And as this image of rail connectivity between the 4 centers in the Randstad shows, it underpins polycentricity in the Netherlands. Within city centers, possibly less so. In cities that rely heavily on service-centered employment, such as those in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, post-COVID transit volumes in cities have suffered the most, and inevitably this will affect their future commercial viability. So I'm going to put my money in terms of the future of access and mobility on the humble bicycle. In the peak hour in Amsterdam, there are twice as many bicycles than cars moving in the city center. Almost half of the commute trips in the Netherlands have the bicycle as their access modes, all of train commute trips. And Utrecht Central Station claims the largest bicycle parking in the world with 12,500 spaces. Still, equity must be considered. Even in the Netherlands, where there are 30% more bicycles than people, 1/6 of the population don't own a bike or can't use one. Which leads me to the wrap up. For me, the city center of the future, from a transport perspective, may be more like the one that our parents experienced, rather than the ones that we grew up in. And as I said at the start of my presentation, in terms of fast access and slow mobility, this means probably a case of back to the future. That's it for me.
Right, thank you very much, Tom. So I think straight over to Sandra to talk about culture and heritage.
So I'm going to move to culture and heritage, but first I would like to thank Jeremy, Bob, and Robert for this invitation. So one maybe key dimension, which may seem quite straightforward, is to preserve, regenerate tangible entities and intangible memories of places, identities, and human spatial activities, while also enabling heritage to contribute constructively to the future development of the city center. So as I said, it may seem quite straightforward, but it's actually not an easy task, as there are different challenges that are posed today to city policy makers. And I will try to shed light on 2 of these challenges very quickly and briefly. The first one, I think, when we think of cultural project and heritage preservation, it has traditionally been public-led type of project, but now it's moving more and more and increasingly to partnerships, especially, I mean, with private actors, but also communities. So you have for-profit and non-for-profit type of project, and also financialization, as we can see on this right picture taken from the New York Times, where we have a villa in Rome that has been sold to a private owner and holds a nice Caravaggio on its ceiling. The other example that I would like to use is the case of Quebec City, the historical site of Quebec City, which is faced with increasing an important departure of religious congregations, and which is left with the question of the preservation of these buildings from the congregations, but also the questions of the continuity of the memory of these spaces, with increasing pressure also from the real estate sector, which has become more and more interested in investing in buildings in the historic site. And here we have the picture of Maison Bethany, which was in the hand of the Bon Pasteur sisters, where they had their residency, but this building was also open to the public because they had their a museum which traced their social and cultural history. And as they were aging in 2014, they had to unfortunately close the museum, but they were also faced with the question of what to do with this building and how to pass on also the memory of these places and their activities. Unfortunately, they tried to make different deals, but they didn't get the support of the city authorities, and had to sell the building to a developer. Make it very short, and today basically this house has been turned by the developer into luxurious condominiums. One unit in 2018 was sold for $700,000. So just to give you an idea of the type of places that we could find in this Maison Bethany. So what we see here is that we have this register of physical renovation of an area, which may involve transformation, in some cases even demolition, that can have significant impacts on established users, their practices, and also the status in the psyche of a community, and sometimes even lead to privatization of a place. I think here it stresses something important, which is social cohesion within city center, especially in times of crisis and high movement of population, as we are currently witnessing in Europe with the Ukrainian crisis. When we see this project, the risk is to have types of projects that are completely disembodied from the urban environment, and that only attract businesses, insider audiences, rather than the locals. It also highlights the dichotomy sometimes between the vision of the urban planners, the economic actors and politicians, and the lived space, the needs and the uses of the inhabitants. So the social cultural anchoring of projects is in fact a challenge that needs to seriously be taken into account for the future of a city center. And this leads me to another illustration, which also holds this economic dimension, looking at the city center, historical center of Porto in Portugal, where you also have this massive private investment in the city center, especially by small entrepreneurs and but also developer. And this has also been facilitated by city authorities. They were keen on their investment because this was a mean also to rehabilitate the historical center. The issue is that these private investments have been very prominent in the sector of tourist accommodation and short-term visitor rentals, which has radically and completely transformed the social and the cultural landscape of the historical city center of Porto, which, I mean, some scholars have coined as being tourism gentrification. So you have the spectacularization of the urban landscape with most shops, but also restaurants, cafes, and other facilities that do mostly cater to visitors rather than locals. The city of Porto has reacted on that, following Barcelona and New York, and trying to put a halt to these investments by banning licensing of short-term rentals in certain areas of the historical center of Porto. They have also announced citizen participation for the actualization of the management plan for the historical center. But we may ask ourselves, it's not too late, in fact, for Porto. One last challenge among many others, but I think it's an important one related to climate change and the current energy crisis. I mean, the debate about heritage and preservation linked to sustainability has already been debated quite a bit, but I think it has become more pressing than ever. When we think of new constructions, it's easy to include energy efficiency techniques and density on this new building, but it's less the case for older buildings and the ones located in historical cores. So it raised the questions and issues around densification and energy efficiency, how to actually manage that without disruption in terms of tangible and intangible dimension in historical core, and how to retrofit buildings for energy efficiency. Very quickly, two successful examples, one located in Paris, in the 13th district, which combine energy efficiency with rehabilitation of the building and also densification with the added 2 floors. You can see them on the photograph, on the right photograph. I have to stress that this is a building that is very representative of the modern movement and functionalist movement of the 60s, located in the core of Paris. So it was quite a challenge to sort of make this improvement. And last one, taken from Switzerland, Prangin. It's a small town, but I think it's also very relevant. They were faced with the rehabilitation of 3 old buildings in very bad shape. And the city authorities, together with the residents, there was a referendum around the project, decided to demolish one building that was attached to one of these historical buildings. The building that they demolished was actually also an important building for the history of the community and the town. But they managed to have a trade-off with the space that was left by the demolition of this building. They decided to turn it into a public space and park. And they also turned one of the building into subsidized housing. So in conclusion, when we think about culture, heritage project in city center, we can see that there is a need of a wide acceptance of culture and heritage as key elements of wider social, economic, and environmental ecosystem. They are parts, we have to integrate them in this ecosystem. We also can see that there's a need for better understanding of pressure to ensure retention of authentic local culture and heritage, and the understanding on how changes are affecting residents and users in their social relations with surrounding environment. And finally, that there is a need for social and economical models, with innovative models that ensure environmental friendly solution. I thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Sandra. I think, Jeremy, we can move straight into comments and questions.
Yeah, sounds good to me, Bob. I can just quickly outline this. If you would like to comment, please use the chat functionality and also use the hand functionality if that's something particular you'd like to ask either to one of our panel or collectively to the panel ourselves. I'll hand back to Bob and Robert to handle the panel discussion in a sec. But just to say thank you to our presenters, which were 4 great presentations on 4 themes of image, governance, mobility, culture, and really a huge amount of food for thought there from our presenters. Yeah, I'll just get the ball rolling from back to you, Bob. I guess one question which here at Evercity is we try to think about kind of usable takeaways for our audience of city policymakers. So I'd probably ask each of the presenters what would be their one takeaway you'd like a city policymaker to take back into the world with them. Maybe something to think about before I head back to you, Bob.
Difficult question. I think there's quite a number of things, but I think in terms of the UK context, I think I feel that there's a much greater need to focus on the future and proper planning for the future. I think one of the earlier presentations was focused on strategic planning, and I feel that we don't really have that in the same way in the UK. We had that historically, but that regional planning guidance was dropped, and we tend to focus on very narrow city boundaries rather than city regions, which is probably the appropriate basis for planning.
Okay, thanks. Wing?
I think Jonathan probably stole my idea, but
Stole it. Oh.
I think maybe building on that, one thing I would like to emphasize is really do a stakeholders mapping and put them in a room to look at the future. We emphasize a lot about this forward looking, but how we get there actually matters a lot. Who do you put in the room, and how do you structure their conversation? How do you guide them to looking at the different scenarios? And don't be afraid to be innovative. I think that will be my takeaway.
Okay, thanks. Tom?
I would say technology as an opportunity, but also as a threat. There are images of smart cities which will be full of autonomous vehicles, which is not, I think, a future that we look forward to. So for cities to take as a control over the role that technology is going to play in the future of the city centre from a transport perspective, enabling that fast access to and slow mobility within.
Okay, thanks. Sandra?
Well, I think that's one dimension that seemed to me that came out of the different presentation was the small scale, but without losing the big picture. And when I say small scale, I mean I think about using or going back to the bicycle, for example, and also this focus on the individuals and the social. That is something that came out, and I think that we need to focus more. And this also means that we have then different solution to adapt to the different context.
Okay.
But I have a question if you need questions.
Okay, Sandra, tell us your question.
Okay, so my question was to Jonathan. I actually. Going back to my presentation about the difficulty of retrofitting buildings that are historical, I was wondering if in the case of Essen, because you talked about this sustainability turn and this green turn, was there, some initiatives that were taken in the city center and how?
To be fair, I'm not an expert on Essen. I've researched it as part of the work for this book, but I never practiced in Essen. But I'm not aware of any specific initiatives. I think the focus, probably highlighted to some extent by your presentation, is very much around new build rather than adaptations to buildings. And I think it's a challenge all over the world to deal with that issue. So unfortunately, I'm not aware of that. But that isn't to say that, and we may have some German representatives on this call and may be able to help, but I'm not aware of any. I am aware of projects in the UK at the moment where we are looking to refurbish not so much historic buildings, but buildings from the 1950s and 1960s to bring them up to carbon net zero standards. And I'm working on several projects where, as part of overall refurbishment and change of use, we're doing that. But I think it's different where you've got to work in the context of historic regulations, and there are limits on physically what you can do with a building.
Are there any questions or comments?
I had one from Adrian Fox.
Hello there. Yeah, it's just obviously I work as Winchester City Council as Strategic Planning Manager. And obviously we've traditionally had kind of very restrictive approaches towards shopping. We had primary shopping frontages, secondary shopping frontages, and now obviously it's all about footfall. So it's really basically from a local plans perspective, and perhaps this is to Jonathan because I know him, about how we kind of deal with that issue in local plans, because obviously it's a changing way that obviously town centres are evolving and changing, and it is all about footfall activity and things like that. But do you think obviously the primary and secondary shopping frontages have had their day, and kind of it's time to rethink that?
Yeah, I think from my personal perspective, I think that's right. I think it's obviously very much a UK angle, but we were very focused on protecting the core areas of cities for shopping only, and to the extent of trying to limit the number of cafes and restaurants. And I think a lot of those policies now seem very outdated in context of the way the world's changed, both because demand for retail has reduced, but also we've realised that cafes and restaurants and other uses have got a really vital role to play in enlivening places. So I think that's the case. I think more generally in terms of city centres, I think in the UK context, I would encourage sort of movement away from that, more flexible approaches, but also probably trying to move forward with things like area action plans to sort of focus in on smaller areas within city centres, because I think the old-fashioned approach of a primary shopping area to fix everything, it just doesn't really work, and we need to look at more specific redevelopment within central areas, and something like an area action plan approach is probably the way to go.
It's a mark in the chat. Yeah, it's I'll read it out. I think all 4 presentations paint a future city centre that is, in Sandra's words, smaller, local, and in my words, slower. Does everyone in the audience agree? There's quite a difference from some of the images of smart technology firms have painted. So do we agree that the future is smaller and more local? And does that contrast with maybe these ideas of the smart city we're all, I think, familiar with?
I think Sandra painted pictures of local places. Jonathan, I saw pictures of people sitting outside in squares rather than hidden in shopping malls. I'm talking about bicycles rather than autonomous cars. That is not the picture that I have seen painted of the future of the city centre by many futurologists or technology firms. So have we got it wrong? As 45 people on the call, so contribute, please.
So sorry, Tom, what picture have you seen then, if you haven't seen that picture?
Oh, pictures of complete new build, pictures of
Right.
Of high-tech vehicles around, not of people walking or cycling. A picture of probably a lot of new mobility options rather than walking and cycling. Okay, I guess I'm coming from obviously a transport perspective, and this is not what we have. I think what we have painted and what we've discussed today. So, has there been an expectation, and is there still an expectation that is wrong, that the future will be very different from today?
Yeah, well, if I could make a comment on that, because my feeling is that we need city centres that are not high tech at all. I think the problem with high tech is it makes places anonymous. It creates buildings that people find difficult to relate to. We rely too much on energy guzzling systems to keep the environment the way that people want it. We should be looking for buildings that have natural light, natural ventilation, and what is definite, I would say, and I like Jonathan's comment on this, is that these buildings are going to have very short life in a specific use, and they've got to be very flexible and be able to adopt a number of uses over a short period. We also need much more relationship between inside and outside. We need much more in the way of public spaces, public squares, green spaces that relate to these buildings. So I think it's absolutely not a high-tech future. Now, if that's what's being delivered, then we have to write more and more critiques of that, in my view. Jonathan, do you have a view?
I think we can use technology in a way that can achieve some of those objectives, but it's not necessarily the glossy picture that's painted that I think Tom's referring to, but we can use, as my presentation was trying to pick out in essence as an example, using technology to take us down the environmental route, to try and do more locally, to reduce environmental impacts, etc. So I think you can blend the two. I think the trend over the last 50 years has been in the other direction, but we need to start to use technology to go the other way. That would be my response. I think Peter has his hand up. Peter Gordon.
Peter Gordon.
Yes, moving on to the moving discussion on a bit. I was thinking back to J. Michael Thompson, his Great Cities in the Traffic. I suppose you either have a very centralised city centre, a very unicentric city like Paris, New York, London come to mind, or polycentric, think of the Randstad, places like that. What are your views? What I was thinking of, it's all right saying you have smaller city centres. A number of the attraction city centres, museums, probably have quite a large catchment area. And if you have a very strong city centre, it's very useful for people getting in there. They're very likely to come in by public transport. I mean, if you look at how people get into central London, it's very largely public transport. Small city centres, less so. I suspect in many ways you're stuck with what you've got. There's limits to what you can do. But what's your general view as to, if you like, the very dominant unicentric city centre and the polycentric approach?
Okay, so I think maybe Robert might want to respond to that initially, then perhaps Tom afterwards.
I think it's a really good perspective, Peter. It's one that, as part of the project, that we deliberately looked at slightly smaller cities rather than the global ones, which have tended to dominate the way we've thought about research and the questions we've been asking. And then, secondly, I think you're right that the issue is as much about the Eurocentric notion, or the European, North American notion of it. I think it's one of the things that's lacking perhaps in the conversation today, which is not a reflection of the author's contributions, but more generally the way we debate it, is how much we can learn from other models, and particularly the Global South, where the notion of the city centre is very different historically. It's not been laid out in the same way. It's not been dominated by transport systems in the way that we've been used to of mass transport. And it's much more community-based. It's much more collective in the way activity takes place, mobility takes place, to use Tom's term, and the way it's structured is such that it allows the city centre to be more truly cosmopolitan in the sense of mixing both in the commercial and residential areas. So I think you raise an interesting question there. What we've been suggesting is that there is actually there's an opportunity, I think, to challenge what we see as the norm. And of course, that doesn't mean it's easy to translate from where we are. We have to live with what the landscape we've got. But the idea of smaller, slower, more local is something much more familiar to certain other cities elsewhere in the world.
Thanks. Tom, do you like to
Well,
comment
yeah, I think what Peter says is sort of certainly resonates, and I think it isn't misaligned with sort of my view of what transport needs to be for the city centre, which is access to, but not necessarily access to the heart of where you want to get to. That combination of relatively fast mass transit between centres, but having an environment within the centres where the car is no longer welcome, and even where public transport modes may have to be restrained because there's a mix of other more active modes as being used for that last mile. And I think polycentricity will support that. There will be centres that have got their own identities and characteristics, and people will want to go there, and they can get there relatively easily. It's the experience that we have had over the past 50 years that access means places being accessible to within virtually hundreds of meters, which I think is exactly what needs to be retrofitted.
All right, thanks. Jeremy, have we got some more chat?
Yingyin is just put her hand up, so
Oh, sorry, sorry, I didn't see you.
No worries, I just raised my hand and perhaps just, I think it's a very interesting discussion, so I would just like to make two remarks. I think the first one is more coming from a personal experience. I come from China, and as a speaker mentioned, it's a very different concept of understanding city center, at least in my experience. I grew up in a metropolitan areas with 12 million inhabitants in the city. So of course, that's definitely what you call as polycentric model of city center in my experience. And I really echoed Robert's comment of bringing in this diversity. And the second comment I would like to make building on this is something in my presentation also highlights, and one of the focus of today's event is this future-looking perspective. And what we're trying to bring in is also different scenarios. I think, for example, after COVID, we did a study and trying to imagine how the patterns of different cities will change, and we have different models. For example, we imagine citizens may move out city centers, but in some cases, maybe there will be a trend towards more compact cities. People that just try to share more infrastructure and resources. So I think this is the spirit that I would also like to highlight, is to imagine different scenario and be prepared of it. And more, because we're seeing the traditional way of estimating, it's not really working, and there sometimes will be unexpected shocks that just change the usual way of working. So that's just 2 points contributing to the discussion. And I think Andrew, my colleague, would like to add something.
Andrew.
Okay, Andrew.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to everybody for the presentation. Thank you to Jeremy and Bob for putting this together. Well, I'll just briefly say what my contribution was in our chapter, Yingyin my chapter, and then kind of extrapolate that to the conversation. So I wrote mostly about stakeholder engagement and community engagement, specifically around local residents. I gave a few examples on this. One is a highway that was being built through Dakar in Senegal, but was led by the national level government with a lot of international organizations involved. I wrote about business improvement districts and how they kind of serve as an opportunity for private actors to find a parallel track to get their public service needs met in their small neck of the woods in the city center. But that kind of leads to, while it does succeed in raising the rents and the footfall and the real estate prices, it also can serve to gentrify areas and really prioritize tourists a lot over the city residents in their own city. And, you know, a solution to a lot of these issues, which is addressed in the chapter, is, you know, increased serious stakeholder engagement of local community groups. Not just what we call, at least in the US, a token involvement of having community members on board of a review panel, only on the condition that they just agree to whatever the project is. That doesn't really help. So I just wanted to touch on that from my perspective, but also just to kind of make a synthesis of everything I've heard and I found really interesting, both especially while writing the chapter, I had to be careful in my part not to step on the toes of anyone else, including Tom and Jonathan, because what they presented today is mostly what I work on in general. And I'll just say that I hope we are able to move away from the 20th century model of the city center, the car-centric model, covering, you know, almost 100% of the city center in asphalt and cement, because I think that's playing a big role in climate change. I wrote a blog for the OECD over the summer about heat waves in cities, and how much hotter it is in city centers than their immediate peri-urban surroundings. This has a lot to do with modes of transport, actually, the built environment plays a huge role in not absorbing heat. You could also say it's about flooding. It's harder to get water in and out of the city when it's flooding, when it's all built environments. So I think changing the shape of the city center for residents, not for cars and not for businesses, because a lot of people are teleworking and shopping on e-commerce, is a huge thing to focus on. And I think a way to make sure that cities are designed for people, human beings, not just corporations and cars, is to make sure we're engaging the local community in the decision making for the future of the city center. So that's my best summary of everything I heard and contribution. Thanks.
Right. Thanks for that perspective, Andrew. That was really good. Have we got any more hands, Jeremy?
Comment from Wendy Anderson, so I'll read out. I think Wendy's from Halifax in the UK. Thinks the local authorities should do up small yards and alleyways around the backs of shops, and appreciates the emphasis we've heard on bike transport presentations. And also a comment on shopping centres, which was if shopping centres have been moving out of central areas, they'll be pushed to out of town areas, but there then need to be the need for efficient transport links to these out of town areas for those without their own transport. So we've spoken a bit about that already. So yeah, two comments from Wendy there on the future in that way. I guess before we go to Robert, I think the one for me would be a more general question around. I mean, you, Bob, and Robert both say in your introductory article about the city centre being seen in crisis. So the extent to which that crisis is actually an opportunity to do some of the big things that maybe we want to do. So I'd throw that back to the panel before we go to Robert for the actual remarks.
Yeah, well, I think, Jonathan, you introduced the notion of it being a crisis, didn't you?
Yeah, I don't think I used that on the slides, but I mean, I think in the UK, and I speak from a UK perspective, obviously, we've got historically high vacancy rates. I don't know whether the highest they've ever been, but certainly in the last 30, 40 years, vacancy rates are higher than ever before. The average vacancy rate in all centres, towns and cities across the UK is about 15% at the moment. Many larger centres historically performed very, very well, the regional centres, but even those centres have struggled significantly in recent years. And I think there's a need for sort of greater intervention in those centres, and I think that needs to be led by public authorities in actually planning the change rather than just leaving it to the market to decide, because we've seen what happens when the market decides, and we've seen this sort of dominance of shopping. I think we can use this as an opportunity to put new uses back into centres that will be sustainable over the long term, and help to meet wider needs, and highlighting things like health and education uses coming back into centres. What better location for those sorts of uses than somewhere that's highly accessible by public transport and other modes of transport? Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that it's a combination actually of some of the points that people have raised. The notion of having more governance than government, having it at a local level, as Johnson says, not letting the market decide all the time, setting it within the context of the region that Wing and 1 or 2 others talked about. So I think there's a number of those issues have come out in the presentations and in people's comments. And going back to what Andrew was saying about, we keep forgetting that the place is about people. It's not about property and investment and all the rest of it. It's actually about people. Jonathan, I think, also mentioned the notion of trying to increase the residential component, but actually, there again, as Robert was saying, if you go to the global south, there's a lot of people living in the city centres. So it is learning from other places, but also putting people at the core of this, and responding in really a kind of sort of sensible way. Robert, do you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I mean, I think, Jimmy, you asked the question, the balance between crisis and opportunity. And I think there's one thing we've learned from all the projects and cities we've been looking at, city centres we're looking at, is that from some people's perspective, it's inevitably a crisis. And the question of whose perspective that is makes a big difference. So when we talk about retail as being in crisis, it's one perspective. And we remember we give them a voice, and we've done so, as we heard in the earlier presentation from Jonathan, you know, over the last 30 or 40 years, has been giving them a more dominant voice over anyone else. If you ask communities, if the city centre is in crisis, they have a different perspective. Some don't know much about it, some don't care, some don't involved in the city centres. Some think it's brilliant because they see the city centre having a change in the environment in terms of being more dynamic, younger, open spaces, much less dominated by the commercial pressures that sometimes they feel under. Particularly the cost of living crisis is revealing that even more strongly. So there are different ways of looking at this as both crisis and opportunity. And I think that if there's something I could do to summarize all of this, and I'm going to come to a few slides just to finish in a minute or two, I think part of the crisis element is the way we think of the city centre as being dynamic. You know, look over the history of cities. The city centre is always changing. It's always under pressure to change. And it's the relationship between the city centre, the downtown, the CBD, whatever we call it, and the rest of the city that creates the crisis. And it's the positioning of what we mean by the city centre that matters, what we want from that. And as I say, different perspectives want different things in that space. And what we've been learning is that across the world, different sorts of cities are responding in different ways, but they're also responding, creating those opportunities and making something of them in order to be positive to certain groups of people, understanding that others won't like it, others won't get what they want from it. So the point that Wynne made, who's in the room for the discussion, becomes very critical to the whole discussion about how you frame the future of the city centre. Yeah. Jonathan, you wanted to add to that?
Can I just say something before, and then I'll go to Jonathan, then back to Robert. I think one of the great mistakes and something which we have to change in the 21st century was that the 20th century seemed to be about product rather than process. And it's really following up on what Robert was saying is, the city is constantly in process, and there are constantly tensions in all sorts of different directions that we have to navigate our way through. Jonathan.
Yes, I just wanted to say, I agree to a large extent probably with what Robert was saying, but I think it's important to remember that city centres are a source of civic pride. And when city centres fall on the times that they've fallen on recently, with large vacancies, derelict buildings, etc., low levels of footfall, I think there's a knock-on effect for communities, and certainly in the towns that I've been working on in the north of England in particular, that is a real issue. And I think the public, generally communities, want to see their city centres thriving. I think they're content to see a move away from retail. I don't think they're too concerned about that because they've access to retail in other forms now. But I think they do want to see change. And I think as long as that change is happening, that it works. But I think if we just allow the city centres to stay in their current condition and move forward very slowly, I think that's to real detriment. So I think we've got to think about that and understand that concept.
Yeah, just one remark. I wanted to go back to what Robert just mentioned, and I think it's important that we think about city centre with the rest of the city, and especially the peripheries, because I don't think we can today think the city centre without these peripheries, which actually make most of the urban landscape today. So yeah, I just wanted to stress that when I was mentioning, this local with the big picture. I think we need this local, but in understanding in a comprehensive perspective.
Yeah. I think all the presenters would be with you on that, Sandra, from what I've heard from all of them. Shall we go to Robert now for the summing up?
Just a few things to sum up on what we've been getting from the presentations. I think first of all, reflect a little bit on where we started this whole set of conversations, and it's the point you're making, Jeremy, about this change, crisis, opportunity in there, is that if there's one thing that is common across city centres, is that they are being subjected to change in a way that has been different. It may be more change, maybe a different sort of change, but they're asking really quite important questions. And the book itself and all the authors, and thank you to the four of you for contributing to the book and what we're doing elsewhere, is that the very notion of the city centre and what it is at the beating heart is being challenged. We can no longer take it for granted. And some of those are the challenges we've been hearing about, the flight of retail, public spaces, but also the question of for whom, who is the city centre for, and how do they get represented in different areas and have given a voice as part of that future of the city centre. And then there are mechanisms, the nature of the shift from governance, regional ones rather than localisms, and conflicting policies around the city centre. We put in the bit we wrote that you can read around this presentation is, how does the 15-minute city, for example, challenge the very notion of having a city centre and the functions the city centre has traditionally had if we're going to make it in the new form of localism. But there are opportunities. And so looking forward, we've been encouraging everyone to think about those opportunities, about how the city centre might continue to have its economic role as being the powerhouse, it's the heart of the urban agglomeration and different forms of that. How it might be the centre of people's lives, and that includes people living in cities, and the nature of that, and the sort of approaches that have been done in the city centre to encourage people back in much greater diversity than perhaps we saw in the 1980s and 90s about gentrification that brought a particular group of people into the city centre, but trying to think of the city centre as being much more cosmopolitan and mixed in terms of the residential base. And perhaps the fundamental question that's been mentioned by all the speakers in various different ways is, what can the city centre do? And how can it work in terms of reflecting the really global crises and challenges that we're facing, including climate change? What can the city centre do to show in terms of leadership? Because the reality is, if it cannot address these sorts of fundamentals, then we've got a real problem as to whether the city centre can continue and what it can do and will have in the long-term function. So, our way forward. Let me leave you with three thoughts from today's, from the presentations and from our work. First of all, each city is unique, but it comes, and all of them are facing similar challenges. There needs to be much greater sharing of what's actually happening. That leads to the second one, which is our thoughts that we need much more collaboration. Sandra made that point. Importantly, we have to move away from thinking of city centres in competition and much more as being connected to their own urban environments and the wider city, and connected to each other, and connected within the global economy and the global society. We think of cities in competition, but there's no reason why city centres have to be in quite the same sort of competition, and more connections important. And thirdly, there has to be a much greater widening of the dialogue about what's the vision of the future of the city centre. One of the things we started with in our project was to look at the master plans, the visions people had in our 4 cities. And they inevitably, perhaps, have been set up largely by a small group of people who have been empowered to do that. But if it's going to be realised, the city centres are going to have the future that we're all been arguing for in the presentations, then we need to have alternative viewpoints. We need to engage with different people. And so our project is just the start. And we'd like to encourage you all to read the book, of course, that's promoting it to date as an opportunity to when it comes out, but also to join us in the conversation about this as we set up the Future of City Centre networks, because we're trying to bring together those who have got a share our interest and desire to do something about change in the city centre. And we hope you'll join us for that. So thank you very much, Jeremy, for the opportunity. Thank you to our 4 authors for our presentations, and thank you all for the audience.
Thank you very much. And yeah, goodbye from me as well. Thanks for the presentations. Thanks to IPPO as well. And I will now share my screen because you can continue the conversation in various ways. By @Cognitive Society, you have the website address there for IPPO and for the Future City Centre Network, and 3 forthcoming IPPO events as well we hope to see you at. So thank you to our presenters, thank you to Bob and Robert, and see you soon.